Welcome. I'm Anne Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America, and welcome to our very first conversation with the CEO. We are pioneering a new type of event that allows all of you to ask questions and to have really a more intimate discussion. And I couldn't be happier to kick this off with Dr. Judith Rodin and her new book, which is Making Money Moral: How a New Wave of Visionaries is Linking Purpose and Profit. So I will just hold it up. It's a fabulous book. It's also a book that is small enough really to be read quickly, but also to be kept as a manual. So Dr. Judith Rodin was is a former president of the University of Pennsylvania, the first woman president of the University of Pennsylvania. She took that job after a very distinguished career as a psychologist at Yale. And then after stepping down from the University of Pennsylvania, she was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And really, I'm just going to say a transformational president. She pioneered an entire study, sort of project and campaign on resilience that was well ahead of its time and is having impact in cities across the country. She did a lot of what she'll be talking about today in terms of impact investing, supporting it, experimenting with it. And just in so many ways, she used the enormous resources of the Rockefeller Foundation as catalyst and really as transformational funding. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Rodin to start by talking about the sort of major themes of her book. I will then ask her some questions and we'll open it up to all of you. Judy.
Well, thank you, Anne Marie. It's wonderful to see you. And thank you for having me in this, what looks like an inaugural event for you, and one that I think will be terrific as you bring people in and share your ideas and look for new innovative spaces. And this certainly is one. Sustainable and impact investing has grown so exponentially in the last 15 years. It now has over $30 trillion of assets under management globally, which is extraordinary and a far cry from what we expected when we brought a group of investors and entrepreneurs together at our conference center in Bellagio, Italy, where the term impact investing was coined. And I think during the subsequent years, there have been many things that fuel the momentum, but I think it especially, I would say, has been the growing view in so many sectors that the unfettered view of profit and the mantra of shareholder primacy are simply no longer acceptable, and that so many are looking for ways that purpose and profit can be linked. I think an additional momentum driver has been that it's just become increasingly clear to business leaders, to investors, to policymakers, that neither business nor the financial markets will be able to successfully outrun the growing number of social and environmental stressors that we're seeing now and will only accelerate over the future. So my former Rockefeller colleague, Sadia Madsberg, and I, Sadia led the work in this area for us, decided that this was a great moment to really evaluate, explain, and where appropriate, help to continue to accelerate this field. And so we used data-driven research, case studies, we conducted a lot of interviews. And through that, I would say we were able to identify key players, to really point to promising and very interesting approaches. And we came to it, obviously, as funders, as investors, and as conveners who were there at the beginning. But I would also say that our front row seat gave us the opportunity to really evaluate the field. And there's a lot of great things happening, but we also focused a lot on measurement and impact integrity in the book. And I think that's critically important. And of course, since writing the book, we were writing it in 2020, the world fundamentally changed. While a positive part of it was that through Zoom, we had access to many people around the world for interviews whom we might not have been able to include in the book. But of course, COVID has really changed, I think, the nature of the discussion around this issue. I would say that people are really asking what it will be like in the financial markets and who's obligated to do what in a post-pandemic era. So how could private finance be used in more innovative, even more innovative perhaps, than creative ways to build and sustain communities and workers and livelihoods? Second, what role should capital markets be playing in preserving the environment and fighting climate change and protecting natural resources? And then what kinds of climate commitments should businesses be making to get to net carbon zero? And the financial sector is being pushed in really interesting and extraordinary ways, so that I think this conversation and hopefully the book will be useful for investors who are seeking to invest for themselves or as a fiduciary for clients, certainly for what we call problem solvers who are seeking the capital, and certainly for business students. The book is written actually in chapters that would follow a curriculum week by week, and we did that intentionally because we want to influence the next generation.
So I love that. And actually I did, as I was reading it, I thought of it as really, this is a manual. This is a book that if you're in impact investing, it's a great thing to have just to remind yourself to think about the different terms. If you're new to it, it's the perfect primer. So I love the fact that you were thinking about business school. Talk a little bit about the big sort of jumps in its evolution, because even a decade ago, or maybe 7-8 years ago, it was social impact investing, right? And it was seen as it was kind of very boutique thing. And I remember watching it sort of shift from social impact investing to impact investing, but talk a little bit about how you see the phases of its development.
It certainly, as you said, was very niche at the beginning. It tended to be small private investors, family offices, philanthropists who were trying to think differently. But this has shifted so dramatically to public markets. We see all kinds of investments in literally every asset class. But we take some credit for helping to foster that evolution. And it really started at that Bellagio meeting in 2007. What the investors told us was that while they were doing it, it still not only felt niche and social, and they were really financing small entrepreneurial growth companies, if you will, and thought maybe that was the market, but they hoped that it could accelerate. And so we decided, rather than investing our money in actual social impact funds, we would take our philanthropic capital, and we invested about $60 million over 5 years in building out the infrastructure of this field. So we built a common platform that the investors used, because early on they didn't want to develop their own internal platforms. They weren't doing enough of it. We funded all of the early work on metrics, IRIS, SPHERES, many of the earliest things on impact metrics, because the investors would say to us, you know, I know how to do financial due diligence, but I don't know how to do social due diligence. I don't know how to do impact due diligence. We funded a lot of policy work because we bumped up, we talked to pension funds, but we bumped up to ERISA requirements and minimum threshold obligations in insurance vehicles, and we wanted to overcome that. And we worked with a lot of governments and sovereign wealth funds and pension funds early. So the field exploded, and it is now, and this is what is so incredibly exciting, you can have an impact or sustainable investment in every single asset class. So in alternatives, there are huge multi-billion-dollar venture funds like TPG Rise, KKR, Apollo. Several of them have multi-billion-dollar funds for VC and private equity investing in this space. There's very interesting insurance vehicles and the like. In fixed income, we see REITs, real estate investment trusts that are social or are built sustainably. We see blue bonds, green bonds, resilience bonds. And then, of course, in the public markets, and this is where it really has exploded, because with the development of exchange traded funds, and now hundreds of ESG exchange traded funds available to the retail investor, that's what's leading to the $1 trillion number that I cited earlier. So it's really been in the public markets and in passive index funds, if you will, ETF funds, where the enormous explosion in the last 5 years has been literally mind-boggling.
So, you know, what's interesting, not just your impact on this field, but as I was listening to you, I was thinking about what it takes to create a field. You know, New America has been working with the Ford Foundation to create the field of public interest technology. And as I'm listening to you, you had the idea, you had the vocabulary, you brought the core people together, but then it was advocacy, measurement, policy, all those different dimensions of what it takes to find the pain points and help remove them, and time, right? It's extraordinary to hear how much time to get from, you know, millions to hundreds of millions to billions to trillions, which is extraordinary.
I would say, Anne-Marie, the other thing in terms of your effort and what we saw is building the platforms allowed you to build the right partnerships. So we early on partnered with JP Morgan because we felt a critical global bank that had not only private wealth clients, but all kinds of vehicles. And for example, then we're financing fossil fuels. Why don't we try to get them in the loop as a partner? The British aid agency DFID, and a few other actors. So we picked different sectors that we thought would be relevant to this field expanding rapidly. And we brought them in the tent as strategic partners early on.
That's very important. That's worth thinking about. I want to ask you about just the vocabulary, because even as you talk about it, you know, you say you can have a sustainable investment, or you can have an impact investment, or we often hear the ESG funds, environmental, social, and governmental funds. And then you also hear things like patient capital for acumen and places. And one of the things I found so valuable in this book is you do unpack some of those differences. Some of them mean the same thing, but some of them don't. So if you would just talk about some of the sort of common labels, just even impact investing versus ESG investing. And of course, now there's SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals investing. Is that all the same thing?
No. So the earliest work was really on what you referred to as patient capital, where entrepreneurs had a great idea. They were in the earliest stages of the effort, and patient capital looking for a very small return, maybe 1 or 2%, and would be there and for a longer period of time. This field is not that anymore at all. And I think that's really important for our attendees to understand. In every one of these asset classes that I mentioned earlier, the returns are typically as good as or better than the benchmarks in that asset class. So this is no longer patient capital. This is no longer concessionary return levels. This is making money and doing good at the same time, whether it is in the social space or in the environmental space. It's critical. In 2017, I think, two Dutch pension funds analyzed the SDGs. And they suggested that there were only 2 of the 17 that probably were not investable: peace and human rights. But of the other 15, all, maybe not every sub goal within it, but all of the other 15 were truly investable, and investable either in companies, in funds, in collaborative projects. And I can talk about some of the examples because they're amazing ones. ESG is always used when it's a public equities fund. So if you're trying to say you're a social or environmental fund, it's a requirement that you have an ESG rating. The problem is that not all ESG rating systems are the same, and it still is leading to a lot of confusion in the field and legitimate concerns about impact washing or greenwashing, which I think is still a legitimate concern.
Meaning it doesn't really have the impact that it's supposed to. It just has the
Right.
label.
So that's one concern. The other is that there are so many different ESG metrics that so many rating agencies are using that it often is confusing. For example, the Wall Street Journal looked at 3 different ESG ratings of Tesla and Exxon. And in 2 of those 3 ratings, Exxon was higher than Tesla, which is unimaginable, except that in 2 of the 3, governance had a higher criterion and added more weight than environmental. So you can see that there is still some confusion. The field of ESG metrics is still evolving. I would say that in impact, and why I am so interested in continuing to facilitate this, we're moving from impact measurement to impact management. And that means that the investors are now able, in the due diligence phase, to determine the degree of impact that's expected and the dollar worth for that degree of impact. So almost the impact return of money, the IRR on the impact side, which is really interesting for that particular investment. Then they're able to track through metrics the actual investment, but they're able to manage the companies to enhance their impact so that it's not passive investing or passive investors. They're playing a really significant role. We're also, I'll give you one more example. I think we're seeing a tremendous shift in our perception of what an activist investor is. You know, it used to be the investor who wanted to break up the, I won't mention names, but the investor who said you have to break up the company, we're going to buy X number of shares in order to unlock value, harass the management, etc. Now what we're seeing is a lot of huge funds are activist investors for social and environmental outcomes that they want the company to achieve. Get off fossil fuels, make a net zero carbon commitment, do whatever. So that we're seeing a transformation actually in the role of the activist investor in all of this as well, which is, I think, another evolution that's exciting.
Yes, and the just the whole idea, and just to underline it, that this is not concessionary, that this really is, as the title of your book suggests, linking profit and purpose in ways that do not undermine profit, but put it to work in the service of a larger purpose. I want to ask you to give us some of the concrete examples, but I also want to remind all of our participants, please put your questions in the Q&A, and I will be turning to asking them after a few more of my own. So you don't have to wait, do it as we go. But do give us some of the best examples, because I think, again, just as the fields evolved, some of them are quite surprising. It is just such a long way from the kind of social enterprise niche place that a lot of this work started.
Maybe the easiest way is to just start by saying that we talk about 3 categories: the asset owners, We're all familiar with pension funds, the endowments, the sovereign wealth funds, and they have become much more activist in this space. So they're pushing the second group, the money managers, to come up with new kinds of products that are innovative, productive, socially and environmentally, and produce a sizable return. And then the third group we call the problem solvers. And I would say that there are two categories. Both the companies, whether it's the entrepreneurs in the growth phase before they become public, or the large public companies, all of those are seeking capital in order to advance their products in the social and environmental space. And then there's the public and not-for-profit, so governments who are issuing, as I said, many different kinds of bonds than what we saw as traditional bonds 10 or 15 years ago, all in this space. We saw the EU issue COVID recovery bonds last year. We saw Bank of America issue a big health bond for governments and the like. But the other category, and maybe the less obvious one, is the not-for-profits. So we are starting to see not-for-profits play in this space in really extraordinary ways. So I mentioned earlier that some do have investable programs. So let's take an example, the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy for many, many years was working with communities in conservation efforts in coalfield towns in the Appalachians, in Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky, many of which are environmental disasters. And they were using grant and philanthropic capital. In 2017, they raised a $150 million fund with Brown Advisory from a variety of large-scale investors. And with that fund, they bought 250,000 acres along the Clinch River in one of the towns they were working with, St. Paul. The Clinch River is the home to the largest number of endangered freshwater species in North America. So the runoff had been a very significant concern. They bought the land around it. The investors will get repaid in three ways. First, carbon offsets. Second, the sale of sustainable timber, which is what is being developed there. And third, ultimately, the sale of the land. So they will get what a fixed income instrument would produce, a very high single-digit return. So a very different way for the TNC to achieve its goals. Let's take another example that also, I'm trying to pick examples actually that impact communities directly so that you can see how the social and environmental goals can get blended as well. It's not either or. Magic Johnson, the basketball legend, was doing some really interesting social housing work in LA. And he became friends with and then partnered with a large former money manager who decided to go out on his own and create with Magic social REITs, so social real estate income trusts. He raised significant funding from very traditional investors, pension funds and others. And they built sustainable, affordable housing, attractive housing for that category of people that we've been celebrating all last year. The service workers, the firemen, the teachers, the people who Magic showed were spending about half of their disposable income on rent and not getting a lot for it, and often having to commute a long way in order to do it. They were so successful in that they've transformed their model again. So now they raise very large funds, then they create companies that build this housing. Before they were just restoring housing. And in the units, in the common spaces of the housing developments, they have childcare, they have healthcare, they have arts projects, community gardening projects, and the investors are making a ton of money. So, and they're not charging rapacious rents, obviously. So a win-win-win. Community development, financial return, social and environmental return. We saw hundreds of these all over that were really, really extraordinary. But if I can take one more minute, because we're with you, I want to focus on other ways that not-for-profits can play in this field. Because obviously, obviously I said,
how they can do it, but I'd love to know.
Right. So not everything is investable, and I know that, and it shouldn't be. So what are the three other ways that we found that not-for-profits are really playing creatively, besides the investable Nature Conservancy example? Another way is new models for collective action and impact. So let's say you don't have direct assets or programs that would attract investment capital today. You can be part of building the market infrastructure that facilitates capital flows that will have impact in areas that you care about. So we helped create an intermediary called Emergent. And we did it with the government of Norway and the Environmental Defense Fund. And the idea was that protecting tropical forests at scale and creating the pathway to zero deforestation is such an important way to halt climate change. So we worked with the partners that I mentioned to build an intermediary that would facilitate transactions between private companies that either want to buy credits or otherwise finance high quality tropical forest emissions reductions, and the countries, the tropical forest jurisdictions that can generate those reductions. That's part of what they do. Emergent is going to be the intermediary in operationalizing the $1 billion LEAF coalition. LEAF stands for Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance, which was announced just now at the 2021 Leaders Summit on Climate. And so that you can see that the role was really creating a new mechanism and a new model for collective action. A third example would be advisory and technical assistance. So let's take investment in infrastructure, which is very much being discussed right now. There's not only government investment in infrastructure, but there are a huge number of infrastructure investment funds, and they're always looking for sustainable and impact investment opportunities. But often they're challenged by not being able to define impact, environmental impact in particular, or they don't see investment ready projects. Nonprofits can leverage their expertise and networks to actually help shape the design and readiness of investment projects that will have high impact. We see an example of this in C40, the C40 Cities Finance Facility. So they collaborated more than 40 cities around the world, but they're all committed to environment and addressing climate change. And they are now working with the German Agency for International Cooperation to facilitate finance for climate change mitigation and resilience projects in urban areas, because they're providing the technical know-how to create bankable projects. So again, it's their expertise as nonprofits and government entities. There's a recently announced partnership with the Brazilian Solar Photovoltaic Energy Association, which is a not-for-profit, which is going to support Brazilian cities to prepare for projects and shape innovative policy mechanisms to increase the usage of solar energy. And I'll give you just one more, because this is a very cool one and one that I think you'll like a lot. So the fourth category is advocacy. Nonprofits increasingly have been recognizing the power of investment capital to make an impact. And I should say both a negative impact as well as a positive impact on society. And as they understand that, instead of just lobbying against them, they can partner with investors and corporates with the goal of advocating for change in a new way. And so we helped seed a collaboration between the YWCA and a fund called the Impact Shares Fund. And they created a new ETF, exchange traded fund, labeled Women, WOMN.
Okay.
And it makes investments by tracking the Morningstar Women's Empowerment Index, which rates global companies along 4 parameters that are really relevant to women's empowerment and diversity and equality and the like. Impact Shares, the name of the nonprofit manager that issued the ETF, donates all its profits to the YWCA. And the YWCA then engages with those profits with companies on how to implement, they advise the companies on maintaining strong gender equality practices. And as they say, YWCA, the ETF provides them with the tools needed to expand their impact into the private sector and help companies who want to demonstrate leadership on issues that are impacting women. So 4 different ways that we as nonprofits can really transform some of what we do by playing in this field in new ways.
I do love that. I mean, I describe New America as a think tank, yes, but really as a public problem solving organization. And what you're describing is policy is the traditional way that we solve public problems, and we do policy research, and we diagnose the problem and make policy recommendations and advocate them with government, and all of that is hugely important. I mean, we're seeing President Biden try to implement a lot of policies that a lot of places like New America and others have advocated. But what you're saying is there's this whole other world of how you align public purpose with private profit, and that also can be a really important tool of public problem solving. And of course, the two will align. You need policy often around this kind of work to make sure it is doing what it's supposed to be doing. But I love those examples. So I want to ask you, I've got 2 more questions, and we've already got a very good question from the floor, and I encourage others to add them. So I want to ask about a common perception or perception and misperception, and then I'm going to turn to metrics. What I often hear is that there is far more capital pursuing impact deals or the actual investments than there are investments, that there's a mismatch between the demand and the supply. So is that right?
Oh, okay. Yes and no. I do think that that was the case. And that was a fair critique or analysis, at least, until 5 years ago. But I think 2 things have changed fundamentally. One is we've really been able to demonstrate that in many, many, many domains, you can make an impact investment. So climate change led the way. And environmental transformation, carbon reduction, alternative energy, all of those really were early and kind of the foot in the door to demonstrating that this could be done, and it could be done profitably, both on the impact side as well as on the financial return side. But I would say in the last 5 years, all the innovation has been in the social side, in the impact side. And the assessment of the SDGs is accurate. So there are companies that are doing successful longevity, are doing sustainable agriculture, are doing health, femtech, great companies doing things for women, particularly women in the developing world. A variety of areas, every area of the SDG, as I said, besides peace and social human rights, has been shown now to create companies, be investable, and be very, very attractive targets for investment capital. So the last few years has been awash with cheap money. So it may be that it feels a little harder. As that starts to tighten, I think it may rebalance itself a bit if that is the case. But I'll just give you a number and you can see the money. I just read Wall Street Journal reported last week that capital flows rate into funds marketed as ESG reached 152 billion in the last 3 months of 2020. In the last quarter, that was up 88% on the previous quarter, according to Morningstar. Over 700 new funds were launched last year, as asset managers all are starting to feel that they want to get a piece of this wave. So clearly, there's lots and lots of money coming in. And until that gets rebalanced a bit, the feeling that you described may be there, but it will get rebalanced because there's a ton of innovation, as I've been describing, and so much more that we talk about in the book. And that will lead to huge investment opportunities over the next year or so, I believe.
So that, again, I'm going to come back on metrics, but this works so well with the question we have when you're talking specifically about ESG. So this is from Olivia Albrecht, who does oversee the ESG work at PIMCO. And Olivia says that she's interested in your thoughts on US regulations related to ESG investing under the new administration. So that Biden is taking a whole government approach to climate. What type of new regulations could we expect from the US, and how consistent do you think this will be with global regulations like the EU?
But the EU has been the thought leader here, as I know you know, Olivia, and so they evolved over the last 5 years with a lot of investment managers and a lot of corporate CEOs sitting at the table, which is something I want to emphasize because we typically have not done it that way. Or they've been there with their lobbyists rather than really doing group problem solving. And we were impressed by who was at the table as these regulations were developing for the EU. We had a little kerfuffle at the end of the Trump administration when it looked like Secretary Scalia was going to issue regs that would prevent pension funds from investing in these impact funds, something that the Biden administration has already fortunately walked back from. We definitely see an SEC commissioner who has a specific interest in this, and she's already expressed it. And many of us, and I hope you and your colleagues will work with her and work with the SEC to develop the kinds of regulatory framework that will both standardize better and simplify ESG metrics in a way that will be needed so that the regulatory frameworks are clear. You won't get a ridiculous result like 2 rating Exxon higher and 1 rating Tesla higher, which is, gives you real concern about the credibility of those measurements. So I think that will happen. And we welcome enormously a whole government approach to taking this on, because it's not only about finance and financial instruments, it's about how finance can be used to achieve goals that often are attributed only to governments. And so we shouldn't only be talking about a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, although that's important. There are 175 global infrastructure funds that have trillions of dollars that could be put to work, some instead of government money, some alongside government money. So we're too quick, I fear, to turn to government as the only resource for funding some of these things that a lot of the innovation is showing us could be funded by the private sector. Now, there were some missteps early because some of the early infrastructure was privatizing toll roads or parking meters. I am not talking about that. But many of the things that are on the Biden $2 trillion infrastructure bill could also be funded in quite different ways.
That's really it's a different vision of capitalism. And you do talk about that right at the beginning of the book, where you sort of say, neoliberal or Milton Friedman capitalism has failed us. And this is really a different vision of how capital can work, right? Yes, to create wealth, but also to create positive social outcomes, which is really all those externalities, which by definition, they're externalities. They are not part of the investing process, would be brought in and as you say, managed. It's a very
well. We picked the title intentionally to be provocative, obviously, but we were really asserting that making money moral happens when the bold world of finance meets the aspirational world of impact. Because when that happens, then you think about stakeholders beyond merely shareholders. You think about employees and suppliers and the community, and you even view the environment as a stakeholder, the planet, natural resources as a stakeholder. And that's critical to this new view. And you also take a longer term view. The critiques of capitalism were already starting that, it can only be quarterly earnings and shareholders. So that horse was out of the barn. It's really how to catalyze that momentum in these ways that I've been talking about that's making money moral.
I love it. And it's very timely. So one of the major reasons environmental has been out front on ESG has been because it is easier to measure. You can measure, carbon emissions. There are many of the outcomes you want that are subject to scientific measurement. Much harder when we get to social and governance. Governance, in many ways, to me, is the kind of hardest of all. What are you measuring exactly? And you and I both sit on the advisory committee of Y Analytics, that is trying to really use academic research to guide metrics. But you said, we've got lots of conflicting metrics. What do you think is most needed as we think about metrics? And I would also ask it to what role can experts at places like New America play? Because it does seem to me, if you could wave a wand, you'd say, here's a uniform set of metrics. That's of course why markets work, because you've got money, which is the universal, solvent. Everything can be measured in terms of returns. So I'd love to hear your views on what we need most.
I think because the field has evolved so quickly, and I would say 10 to 15 years is very quick. It took venture capital to reach this level of maturity about 20 or 25 years in an earlier era. So the metrics is still kind of a mishmash of many, many different approaches by many, many different entities. And I think that it will evolve in two ways. First of all, there has to be a very significant focus on materiality. No matter what metric you decide to use, you need to make sure that what you measure matters in terms of the amount of impact that it will have for the dollar amount you're putting in. And so as that becomes a more uniform standard, and that's one of the things that we're trying to promote, I think that will be helpful. I think there are new technologies for assessing impact that will be quite important. And then I think we're going to have to figure out whether the metrics should apply differently in each type of investment category. Obviously they're different for venture and public markets and the like, but I mean topically. So would your measures be different for a climate area than it would be for inequality kinds of investments? And I do think that's where we'll evolve. And then finally, although I think some funds will always want proprietary measures, that's part of their secret sauce as money managers and as investors, the more open source metrics we have, and the more like SASB, and the more agreement that there is among researchers who are helping to develop and test them, the better the metrics issue will get resolved, I think. I'm starting to see that happening well.
You mentioned SASB, and you might not everybody may know what SASB is. And I know, again, you had a big role in helping SASB emerge. Talk about what SASB is, but again, how, to what extent could we imagine like an international body or an independent body? I think about this a lot. Who should be the kind of administrator of these sort of open source but global sets of metrics?
So SASB stands for Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And it has a governing board of experts and academics who are doing research. We helped to launch it. And Bloomberg Philanthropies is now the major investor in continuing that work, because they, like we, believe that without good metrics, the field will not evolve correctly and with as much impact as it could or should have. I do think that continuing to use academic research is important. We have a model on the regulation of the internet where we have a not-for-profit entity that actually is responsible for a lot of the regulatory framework, the URLs and the like. And it interests and disappoints me, actually, that they haven't been involved as much or called to be involved in the discussion about whether and how to regulate big tech on the internet.
Yeah.
But they should be. And I think entities like that will need to be in this field as well. ESG will change, Anne-Marie, and I think as a result of last year. So environment is no longer going to be just carbon zero and those kinds of environmental things. It will really be assessments of biodiversity, of how we are using or depleting natural resources. Fitch, for example, has indicated that many of the sovereign bonds that they're going to issue are going to assess water risks in that country as part of their assessment of the rating and risk. So we're seeing air quality risks starting to come in to assessments of sovereign bond ratings. All of this will come into E, whether it's fixed income or public equities. S will transform as a result of last year. What we saw is that we're going to hold companies more accountable for their workers' health, for social outcomes, for their families' health, for workers' rights. We're starting to see all of that momentum here in the US this year. And S will transform in terms of what is measured. And then I think G, in a way, is going to become much more interesting. G has been so far sort of, do they have good governance? Do they have the right tax profile and the like? But when we start to see corporate CEOs being pressured to step up and speak out on voters' rights legislation in their states, to step up and make carbon commitments to all kinds of things that boards used to be pretty nervous about letting their CEOs do. I as I've been on many public company boards where maybe we didn't really want them to do that. That horse is out of the barn too. That is transforming, and CEOs and their companies will really be judged on the G by many things that we wouldn't have asked of them even 5 years ago.
I really agree with that. And it'll start just with demands for transparency, right? And so, if you think about women's pay, right, just pay transparency around women, either race or gender or even age. There are various ways that you can think about demanding transparency as part of good governance. I mean, those goals can be under S, but they can be achieved under G in ways. Or New America has an index called Ranking Digital Rights, where we look at the tech companies and the telecoms companies in terms of how well they respect their users and consumers' digital rights. So you, again, you can think about where those go in either S or G, depending on how, you know, the mechanism. But that's really a huge area. If you just look at how E has evolved, I look at that
Right.
and think if S includes health, and as you say, the overall conditions of for workers, and G as well, it's really extraordinary.
Well, the pandemic has also shown us that because although it doesn't have a direct climate change link, it absolutely has an indirect climate change link. And so the impact of climate on infectious disease, where it's occurring now, how rapidly it occurs, all of the impacts on human health are really extraordinary. And so in many instances, we have to save the planet to save ourselves. You know, it's not only the do-gooder worry about our grandchildren. This is the pressing, I think, existential threat of our time.
So we have another, I agree. We've only got 8 more minutes. We've still got time for your questions. Another question that's come in is, to what extent do you think we're seeing this change as millennials kind of, I mean, they're not so young anymore, but as they take over, I mean, they're the biggest generation working. And the question, I think, was prompted by your point about business schools. But to what extent do you see this also as generational change?
I think we started to see the press towards conscious consumerism really being the leading edge of this for millennials. I remember when I was president of Penn, we had protests on campus by students who didn't want their athletic wear that had the Penn name on it to be made in sweatshops, and that was really the right thing. We, as the academic administration, hadn't really been thinking about it that way, and that was led by the millennials. And they're continuing that same ethos. They don't want to work for companies that they think do bad things. They don't want to buy products from companies that they think are doing bad things. And their impact is significant because it's estimated that the transfer of wealth to millennials in the next 20 years is enormously significant, trillions and trillions of dollars. So these fields of social and sustainable double bottom line, triple bottom line investment are extremely attractive to millennials. And I think that they will continue to innovate and look for new products and expand the field and make demands on their money managers. We have a case in there describing Lisa Pritzker, when she won her lawsuit and had so much money to put to work. And she met with her wealth managers and talked about wanting to invest with her values. And he thought she meant philanthropy. And she said, no, I want to make money. I want investments, but I want to have impact. So she and her husband created a family office where that's the only kind of investing they do. But they couldn't find traditional financial advisors who either could or were willing to help them achieve those goals. And now, of course, we see it in all the major funds, PIMCO, BlackRock, Wellington. I mean, everyone can make that kind of investment option. But the millennials really pushed it.
Yeah, that's really, I probably should know this, but did you push it at Rockefeller to have program related investments with the Rockefeller Endowment?
So the program related investment is coming not out of the endowment, but out of our annual 5%. That's what a PRI is. And yes, we use PRIs obviously to build this field, to make investments in companies that were aligned. We actually saw that some of our greatest leverage came from both making a grant and making an investment in something.
Yeah.
And then we got 1 and 1 wasn't just 2, it was like 4 or 5. We got outsized leverage and impact. So that's how we used our PRIs. Out of the endowment is mission related investment, because
Okay.
that is coming out of the endowment side. And when I left, we had about 200 million under management. I'm sure it's quite a bit more now. But again, and we see Ford committed early to $1 billion in that field. MacArthur, 100 million. Calvert is only doing that with their entire endowment. So I think each philanthropy endowment is really thinking of it as a total set of assets and how they strategically capitalize on and utilize their assets to achieve impact. I don't think university endowments are nearly as creative or are playing in this area with the kind of influence that we see global pension funds, particularly the European pension funds and the Japanese pension funds, and some sovereign wealth funds actually playing. And they're having transformational impact.
Yeah, judging by the signs on the Princeton campus, I mean, when I was an undergraduate, it was trying to get Princeton to divest from investments in South Africa. Now it's in fossil fuel corporate, companies or sometimes gun manufacturers, but it's what they shouldn't be investing in, not urging them to what they should be.
Exactly. I don't want them to divest. I want them to invest and engage and
Yeah.
transform.
Yeah.
That's what my advocacy is really trying to push.
So we have one last question, and it's a tough one. So the question is, how do you see impact investing for racial equity? And how would we think about that?
Well, the NAACP, actually, even before last year, has an impact fund in collaboration with a money manager. I can't remember its name. I talk about it in the book, but easy to find. And they also share some of the management fees with the NAACP so they can achieve their goals. But they only invest in companies that have very clear demonstrated, not policies, but have shown that they walk the walk on a variety of racial and diversity equity issues. So that was an early one. Many more will come out of last year. I am absolutely certain. Alphabet issued a $4 billion racial justice bond last year. So it'll be interesting to see what they invest in. One thing they're going to do is invest in money managers who are diverse. Yep. And those money managers will invest in companies led by diverse entrepreneurs. So you can see there really are multiple pathways. One of the things that excites me about this is that we're no longer locked into a single route to achieve these very critical goals that we have in the social and equity and environmental areas. We have multiple pathways. And more than anything, that's what this book is really trying to demonstrate.
Well, that's the perfect note on which to end it. It's a very hopeful note, and one that, even when government's trying to do big things, as the current administration is, it's hard. And it's not enough. And so the scope of what you're describing, what's already happened in what I agree is a very short space of time. And I think many people don't realize that venture capital wasn't always there, that these modes of and classes of investments and rounds have to be invented and facilitated and again, broadcast. And really opened up so that you have so many different avenues, as you put it, to making money moral, which is a pretty spectacular mission. So Judy, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. Again, I'll just hold up the book. It's terrific. Buy it and give it to the young people in your life, and certainly anybody who's got money to invest. I'm just delighted that we could talk to you about it, and really that you and Saja wrote it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
It's a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.